A lot of talk over the last 24 hours too about press freedom. We saw the front page campaign from the nation's newspapers yesterday censoring out their front pages. How does Australia compare though when it comes to press freedom and when it comes to national security laws that have been introduced over the last couple of decades to some like-minded, intelligence partners, some of our Five Eyes partners, the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand? Professor George Williams is the Dean of Law at the University of New South Wales. He's been taking a look at this and he argues that amongst these like-minded countries, Australia really stands out and for all the wrong reasons. I spoke to him a short time ago. George Williams, thanks very much for your time. Explain to me how Australia has differed from some of our intelligence partners and like-minded countries when it comes to the laws that have changed since 2001.
Well, other countries often look on Australia as being quite remarkable when it comes to the laws we've passed since September 11, 2001. Firstly, it's just the number of laws. It's actually up to 82 counterterrorism laws passed just by our national parliament, and that's been referred to as hyper-legislation, something you don't find even in the United States or other countries which are much higher threat level than Australia. But the other thing is many of our laws go further than what you see in those other countries. Things like the power of ASIO to have people detained, non-suspects. They're citizens, they can be held for up to a week, forced to answer questions. That's not something you even find in a country like Israel. Or when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. We have secrecy laws, we also have restrictions upon journalists, potentially even their jailing, that, again, you just don't find in countries like America, where you find a much greater respect for freedom of the press and, as a result, greater legal protections.
So you're talking even amongst our Five Eyes intelligence partners, the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and perhaps if we focus on the situation for these journalists right now that are in focus, Annika Smethurst and the two ABC journalists, Sam Clark and Dan Oakes, would it be possible in those other countries for them to face prosecution for simply handling national security documents?
I mean, if you look at the United States, for example, you would not expect to see anything like what we've seen in Australia. And indeed, when we saw the events in Australia, one of the immediate reactions from other like countries, including those in the Five Eyes, was, how is this happening in Australia? Or why do we have the laws in place to enable it? In the United States, again, they actually start from the proposition that the freedom of the press is respected in their constitution. It's actually illegal to raid newsrooms unless you've got some compelling reason. It may be, in fact, there's a terrorist or something that really justifies it. But you wouldn't expect a raid simply for revealing information that arguably is in the public interest.
And this comes down to these other countries having a Bill of Rights or indeed, in the US, a constitutionally enshrined protection of free speech.
Well, in every democratic nation bar Australia, the starting point is different when it comes to free speech and free press. And that is, in those countries, they start from the proposition that their constitution or a Human Rights Act, some form of Bill of Rights, says you must give weight to freedom of speech. You must have protection, and when parliaments make laws, they need to do so in line with that value. Now, Australia doesn't have that. We just don't have the same checks and balances. So here, it's pretty much anything goes. We do have an implied freedom in the Constitution, but it's quite weak. And it means, in our case, that the real limits are what are the limits that politicians themselves impose? Where's their self-restraint? But if that self-restraint is not applied, then we just don't have the same backstops as other comparable nations.
Why do you think this is that Australia's had this sort of hyper-legislation response since 2001? What is it about Australia that's seen this develop?
I think one main reason in Australia is that our politicians can. They can pass these laws in forms that just aren't possible in other countries. So if you have, for example, a government in New Zealand or the United Kingdom considering a law that might see the jailing of a journalist, then they would point to their legal system to say, well, in fact, that runs counter to their Bill of Rights, their Human Rights Act. Whereas in Australia, without the backstop, you just don't have the same thing pulling them back. The other problem we've seen in Australia is this has been bipartisan. So we haven't even seen a debate about a number of these laws. They've gone through often very quickly. They've gone through without any opposition actually putting up a fight, and it means that it's been possible to pass a truly extraordinary number of them, sometimes without a lot of public knowledge. And when you remove the backstops, when you add in bipartisanship, you get the system that we have in Australia.
Are we any safer as a result of this when compared to similar countries?
I do start from the proposition we actually need good counter-terrorism laws, and in fact we didn't have them in place in 2001. So governments have been right to protect the community with strong laws that enable the authorities to prosecute, surveillance, all sorts of measures are needed. But too often these laws also impinge upon the media in ways that frankly are not needed to keep the community safe. In fact, I think often in ways that may harm the community by preventing information coming to light, perhaps where there's been a stuff-up in government that we should know about, perhaps even a stuff-up that endangers the community. So what we've seen are laws that are needed, combined with extensions that really go to secrecy and not community safety. And it's that type of extension that just shows where we've got this wrong.
So do you think the sort of demands being made by the media industry at the moment, particularly when it comes to exempting journalists in their day-to-day work from some of these laws, is that the right fix to this problem?
I think it's partially the fix, but it's not enough because, yes, I think journalists are right to be concerned. Yes, we depend upon journalists for the safety and health of our democracy, but what about whistleblowers? They're actually in an even worse position than journalists. They don't even get the benefit of the ministerial directions from Ministers Dutton and Porter, and they have zero exemptions when it comes, for example, to revealing intelligence information. And of course, without an effective whistleblower, often you just don't get the story. I'd also say that it goes even beyond them, and many of these laws trench upon just freedom of speech of ordinary citizens that we like to assume we have, but there again we've seen a growing intolerance, a lack of self-restraint. And so I think this is a deeper free speech problem than just the freedom of the press.
All right, Professor George Williams, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.